Welcome to this rapid revision session looking at ranchers versus homesteaders. How did these groups come into conflict on the Great Plains? But as a bit of a recap, what was the Homestead Act of 1862? Do you remember? How much land would it grant? What were the conditions of keeping that land? Well, the Homestead Act of 1862 was designed to encourage migration onto the plains for farmers. They were granted 160 acres of land, but the conditions were that they paid a $10 administration fee and that they farmed that land successfully for 5 years, thereby proving it up into farmland. If they managed that, then they could keep that 160 acres of land for free. Ranchers, though, would often come into conflict with homesteaders on the plains, and here's why. The ranchers had these interests. Ranching required huge amounts of public grazing land, around 2,000 acres or even more. Ranchers used both legal and illegal tactics to block homesteaders from claiming public grazing land that their ranching relied upon. You might be wondering how they got away with using illegal tactics. Well, let's not forget that these ranchers were phenomenally wealthy. Very often the poor homesteaders that they were up against couldn't afford to claim back against them. The homesteaders, on the other hand, had these priorities. Homesteaders claiming land under the Homestead Act turned little pockets of public land into private farms that they effectively owned. Ranchers accused them of rustling, which meant stealing the free roaming cattle on the plains. They also complained that homesteaders' barbed wire fences harmed their cattle. Equally, you can imagine that the homesteaders were complaining that the ranchers' cattle were damaging their crops. And so these different competing aims meant that these groups were going to come into conflict. But the ranchers usually had money and power on their side, and the small homesteaders had neither. Let's have a look at some of the methods. Ranchers would make Homestead Act claims on bits of land with watering holes. This made the rest of the surrounding land unattractive to homesteaders, so effectively the ranchers could use that as well. This was legal, but fairly dubious in terms of morality. Ranch hands and family members of ranch owners made Homestead Act claims themselves and then handed the land back to the ranch. This strictly was not legal under the Homestead Act, but it was rarely prosecuted. Rich ranchers bought patches of land from railroad companies where railroads crossed the land. This was done in patches like a chessboard or a checkerboard pattern, meaning that the patches of public land couldn't be used by homesteaders anyway, as they were surrounded on all sides by ranch land. This effectively doubled the amount of land that the ranchers could own. Again, this was legal, but not particularly moral. Rich farm owners who knew that they were acting illegally could take homesteaders to court. The homesteaders didn't have the money to back up their claim in the courts, and so usually they lost their case. Ranchers threatened homesteaders with violence too, so that homesteaders would give up before they had finished their 5 years of farming. Again, this is quite blatantly illegal, but the homesteaders rarely had the legal clout to fight back. Ranchers would damage homesteaders' crops deliberately so that their farms would fail too. Again, illegal, but the homesteaders didn't have the power to fight back. Ranchers accused homesteaders of rustling. These claims were often false, although not always, but homesteaders were far too poor to prove this in court. Homesteaders convicted of cattle rustling faced very heavy punishments in cattle states that relied on the ranchers to make money. You can probably imagine that many of the men in charge of running these states were themselves ranchers, and they had a vested interest in making sure that the ranchers maintained their power. Lastly then, ranchers vandalised and cut barbed wire fences. This was caused cattle to wander onto the homesteads and ruin the crops. Ranchers might even accuse the homesteaders of rustling their cows if they found them on their land. Again, rather dubious behaviour. So we can see there are various ways that the ranchers and homesteaders came into conflict, with the ranchers often being the ones using rather dubious tactics to get what they wanted. Some final points then. Homesteaders and ranchers competed for resources on the Great Plains. Rich ranchers could afford to use dubious tactics against the homesteaders, or even downright illegal ones. A key example of this is the 1892 Johnson County War, which we'll look at in a future rapid revision lesson. Tensions only reduced as ranches became smaller and they fenced off their land. Ultimately, after the Great Die-Up and the fall of the cattle industry, again, I've got a separate rapid revision session on that if you want to go and check it out, the power of the ranchers did decrease somewhat, but it usually was that the homesteaders were at a significant disadvantage in terms of their wealth and power against the powerful cattle barons. That's the end of this rapid revision session. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more rapid revision sessions which I'm releasing regularly. Other than that, I'll say thanks very much for watching, and if you're desperate for me to cover something in a rapid revision session soon, please pop it in the comments below and I'll see what I can do to help. Other than that, thank you very much and goodbye.